Dear Senator Moody, I write to you today from the city of Daejeon in the Republic of Korea as one who seeks justice to a champion of justice. My name is Kim Sun-gi, and I am a 49-year-old elder, known in our Methodist tradition as a Kwanzaa, serving faithfully at Daejeon Jel Methodist Church. By day, I work as an operations support manager at a senior welfare center, caring for the elderly members of my community. By night and on weekends, I operate a small YouTube channel called Sun Patriotic TV, where approximately 7,200 subscribers join me in prayer and advocacy for our nation's future. I am, by any measure, an ordinary man living an ordinary life, in a nation that has been blessed by its friendship with the United States for more than 7 decades. Yet today I write to you about an extraordinary injustice that demands the attention of those who have dedicated their lives to upholding the law and defending the vulnerable. Senator Moody, you are a woman who understands what justice truly means. In 2006, at the age of 31, you became the youngest judge in the history of Florida, when you were elected to serve on the 13th Judicial Circuit Court in Hillsborough County. Before that, you served as an assistant United States attorney in the Middle District of Florida, prosecuting drug traffickers, firearms offenders, and fraud criminals with such excellence that you earned commendations from the Drug Enforcement Administration. You led Operation Roundup, a targeted prosecution of violent and repeat offenders that demonstrated your commitment to protecting the innocent from those who would harm them. You understand the difference between genuine criminals who deserve prosecution and political victims who are persecuted for their beliefs. It is this understanding that compels me to write to you today. This letter you now hold in your hands is the 25th international letter I have written to American leaders pleading for the release of Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon. I have written to President Trump, Vice President Vance, Secretary Rubio, Speaker Johnson, and numerous senators including Lindsey Graham, Ron Johnson, Bill Hagerty, John Kennedy, and Jim Banks. Today I write to you, Senator Moody, because I believe that you, as the youngest judge in Florida history, as a former federal prosecutor who has put over 130 human traffickers behind bars, as a champion of religious freedom and the rule of law, and as one of President Trump's most loyal supporters, will understand both the legal injustice and the human tragedy unfolding in South Korea. A 69-year-old pastor named Jeon Kwang-hoon has been imprisoned for 78 days as of today, March 31, 2026. He is dying in prison for the crime of speaking truth to power, and he needs your voice. Senator Moody, I address you first and foremost as one who has worn the robe of a judge and wielded the gavel of justice. In 2006, you made history by becoming the youngest judge in Florida at the age of 31. This was not a position handed to you through connections or privilege. You earned it through years of dedicated service, first at the prestigious law firm Holland & Knight, where you practiced commercial litigation, then at the United States Attorney's Office where you prosecuted federal crimes. The people of Hillsborough County looked at your record and your character and decided that you, at 31 years old, were worthy of sitting in judgment over their disputes and their lives. That is an extraordinary testament to your integrity and your commitment to justice. As a judge on the 13th Judicial Circuit Court, you did not simply dispense rulings from the bench. You created programs to help the most vulnerable members of society. You founded the Attorney Ad Litem program, recruiting volunteer attorneys to stand in the place of parents who did not appear in court with their children. Think about what that means, Senator Moody. You saw children coming into your courtroom without parents to advocate for them, and you created a system to ensure that every child would have someone standing beside them, speaking for them, protecting their interests. You also developed a mentoring program for at-risk youth within the juvenile delinquency system, working to redirect young people away from lives of crime and toward productive futures. These are not the actions of someone who simply follows the law. These are the actions of someone who understands that true justice requires compassion and creativity. I tell you about Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon because his case represents everything that a judge like you would recognize as a travesty of justice. He has been arrested and charged with inciting insurrection, yet the presiding judge in his case, Judge Park Ji-won, openly criticized the prosecution on February 27, 2026, stating that the charges are unclear, that specific perpetrators have not been identified, and that the prosecution has failed to establish how Pastor Jeon's words led to any specific illegal acts. The judge told the prosecution, in open court, that they should reconsider their indictment. Senator Moody, you know what it means when a judge criticizes a prosecution in such direct terms. It means the case is fundamentally flawed. It means the defendant should not be in prison awaiting trial on charges that even the judge finds inadequate. Yet Pastor Jeon remains behind bars, his body failing, while the court delays its decision on bail. This is not justice. This is persecution dressed in judicial robes. As the youngest judge in Florida history, you understand that youth and inexperience are no barriers to wisdom and integrity. Pastor Jeon organized peaceful rallies at Gwanghwamun Square for 7 consecutive years, from 2019 to 2026. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered to sing hymns, to pray, to recite the Lord's Prayer, and to wave Korean, American, and Japanese flags celebrating the alliances that have kept Korea free. Not one act of violence was initiated by Pastor Jeon or his followers in 7 years. Not one. Yet the government of South Korea has imprisoned this 69-year-old man and compared him to armed rebels committing treason. Senator Moody, you have spent your career distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent. I ask you to look at Pastor Jeon's case with the eyes of the judge you once were and recognize the injustice for what it is. Senator Moody, before you wore the robe of a judge, you wore the badge of a federal prosecutor. You served as an assistant United States attorney in the Middle District of Florida, where you prosecuted drug traffickers, firearms offenders, and fraud criminals. The Drug Enforcement Administration commended you for what they called prosecutorial excellence and outstanding initiative in drug law enforcement. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement recognized you for leading Operation Roundup, a targeted prosecution of violent and repeat offenders. These are not minor accolades. They represent the recognition of your peers and your superiors that you are someone who knows how to build a case, how to present evidence, and how to distinguish between those who deserve prosecution and those who do not. As a former federal prosecutor, you understand the concept of selective prosecution better than most. You know that the power to prosecute is one of the most awesome powers that any government possesses, and that this power can be abused to target political opponents rather than genuine criminals. This is exactly what has happened to Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon. Under the administration of President Moon Jae-in from 2017 to 2022, Pastor Jeon was arrested 3 separate times and charged with an astonishing 76 criminal offenses ranging from election law violations to public safety infractions. The cases dragged on for years, consuming his time, his resources, and his energy. And in the end, after all the investigations, all the trials, and all the appeals, Pastor Jeon was found not guilty on every single charge. All 76 accusations were dismissed by the courts as politically motivated, lacking in evidence, and fundamentally unjust. Now the pattern of selective prosecution has resumed under President Lee Jae-myung with even greater intensity. On January 13, 2026, Pastor Jeon was arrested yet again. The Supreme Prosecutor's Office initially rejected arrest warrants for both Pastor Jeon and another leader, Representative Shin Hae-sik, due to insufficient evidence. It was only after political pressure from the highest levels of the Lee administration that the warrant for Pastor Jeon alone was approved, while Representative Shin remained free. Senator Moody, as a prosecutor, you know what it means when the initial warrant request is rejected for insufficient evidence but then approved after political pressure. It means the case is not about enforcing the law fairly, It is about silencing a prominent voice that opposes the government's agenda. You prosecuted real criminals during your career. Pastor Jeon is not a criminal. He is a political prisoner. The contrast between Pastor Jeon's peaceful advocacy and the government's violent response is stark. For 7 years, Pastor Jeon organized weekly prayer rallies where participants sang hymns and waved flags. Not one incident of violence. Yet the president of South Korea has compared him to armed rebels committing treason. Senator Moody, you spent your career prosecuting actual violent criminals. Drug traffickers who destroyed families and communities, firearms offenders who endangered innocent lives. You know what real crime looks like. Pastor Jeon's case is not about crime. It is about a government using the tools of prosecution to destroy its political opponents. As someone who wielded those tools with integrity throughout your career, I ask you to speak out against their abuse in South Korea. Senator Moody, your work in combating human trafficking represents one of the most remarkable achievements of your career, and it speaks directly to your commitment to defending the defenseless. As Florida's Attorney General from 2019 to 2025, you served as chair of the statewide Council on Human Trafficking. Your Office of Statewide Prosecution charged more than 130 human traffickers with a near-perfect conviction rate. You created the Human Trafficking Strike Force, working with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and local law enforcement agencies to coordinate efforts across the state. You launched the Highway Heroes campaign to train truck drivers to spot and report trafficking. You established the 100% Club to recognize businesses that train their employees to identify trafficking victims. You hosted the annual Human Trafficking Summit, bringing together experts from across the nation to share strategies for combating this modern form of slavery. The United States Department of State estimates that there are 27.6 million people trafficked worldwide at any given time. These are human beings, Senator Moody, stripped of their dignity, their freedom, and often their lives. They are the most vulnerable among us, and you have dedicated a significant portion of your career to rescuing them and punishing those who exploit them. Your near-perfect conviction rate against traffickers demonstrates not only your legal skill but also your moral determination. You understand that some injustices are so profound that they demand action, that they require those with power and position to speak out and intervene. The persecution of Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon is such an injustice. Pastor Jeon has spent his life defending the vulnerable, just as you have. He organized rallies not for personal glory but because he believed his country was heading in a dangerous direction and someone needed to sound the alarm. He spoke out against policies that he believed would undermine the U.S. Korea alliance and leave his nation vulnerable to aggression from North Korea and influence from China. He gave voice to millions of Korean Christians who felt that their faith and their values were under attack by progressive governments that view religion as an obstacle to their agenda. And for this, for speaking truth to power, he has been imprisoned by a government that compares pastors to armed rebels. Senator Moody, you have rescued trafficking victims who were held in physical chains. Pastor Jeon is held in chains of a different kind, the chains of political persecution, but his situation is no less urgent. He is 69 years old. He has undergone 3 cervical spine surgeries with 3 metal rods permanently implanted in his neck. He has lost bladder function entirely and must forcibly expel urine multiple times daily using a drainage device. He cannot walk properly without assistance. His spouse must feed him his meals directly, and yet the court continues to delay its decision on bail while his body fails. Senator Moody, you have fought to rescue the oppressed throughout your career. I ask you to raise your voice for Pastor Jeon, another victim of oppression who desperately needs someone to speak on his behalf. Senator Moody, your commitment to protecting the vulnerable extends far beyond your work against human trafficking. When you were a young attorney at Holland and Knight, practicing commercial litigation, you volunteered in your spare time to assist domestic violence victims seeking protection in court. You did not have to do this. Commercial litigation is lucrative work, and your time was valuable. But you chose to spend that time helping women, and sometimes men, who were fleeing abusive relationships and needed legal protection to keep themselves and their children safe. This early commitment to pro bono work for the vulnerable speaks to your character in ways that no political resume ever could. As a judge, you continued this commitment by creating programs to help those who could not help themselves. The Attorney Ad Litem program you founded ensured that children would not face the court system alone when their parents failed to appear. The mentoring program for at-risk youth you developed sought to interrupt the cycle of delinquency and incarceration that destroys so many young lives. These were not programs mandated by law or required by your position. They were initiatives you created because you saw a need and felt compelled to address it. They demonstrate that your commitment to justice goes beyond simply following rules and procedures. It extends to actively seeking out the vulnerable and creating systems to protect them. Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon is vulnerable in ways that should move anyone who has dedicated their life to protecting the defenseless. He is 69 years old, an age when most people have retired to enjoy the fruits of their labors. Instead, he sits in a prison cell, his body deteriorating, separated from his family and his congregation. On March 28, 2026, just 3 days ago, Pastor Jeon's defense attorney Kang Yun-jae reported on Pastor Jeon's condition. The attorney stated that despite being in extremely difficult circumstances, Pastor Jeon is relying solely on the Lord, giving thanks in all things, and persevering. The attorney described Pastor Jeon's faith as transcending the limits of human endurance. Senator Moody, this is a man of extraordinary spiritual strength, but his body is failing him. He needs medical care that the prison cannot provide. He needs to be with his family. He needs to be free. You have spent your career creating safety nets for those who fall through the cracks of society, domestic violence victims who needed protection, children who came to court without parents, at-risk youth who needed guidance, human trafficking victims who needed rescue. Each of these populations represents people whom society had failed, and you stepped in to fill the gap. Pastor Jeon represents another such case. The South Korean justice system has failed him. The international community has largely been silent. But you, Senator Moody, have the voice and the platform to make a difference. I humbly ask you to use them. Senator Moody, your loyalty to President Trump and your commitment to his agenda give you a unique opportunity to make a difference in Pastor Jeon's case. During the 2020 presidential election, Politico described you as one of Donald Trump's biggest surrogates in Florida. You campaigned tirelessly for the president, defending his policies and his character against attacks from the media and political opponents. After Joe Biden was declared the winner, you took a leading role in supporting President Trump's efforts to challenge the results, demonstrating your unwavering commitment to him even in difficult circumstances. During the first Trump administration, you were appointed to serve as a commissioner on the Presidential Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice, working directly to advance the president's law enforcement priorities. Your loyalty has been rewarded with the trust and respect of President Trump and his supporters. When Governor Ron DeSantis needed to appoint someone to fill the Senate seat vacated by Marco Rubio after Rubio became Secretary of State, he chose you. This was not a random selection. Governor DeSantis knew that you would be a reliable ally for President Trump's agenda in the Senate, someone who would fight for the policies and values that the president champions. Your position as a senator gives you access to the president and influence within the administration that few others possess. Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon is one of President Trump's strongest supporters in all of South Korea. His weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square consistently celebrated President Trump's approach to North Korea, his commitment to strong alliances, and his America First foreign policy. The participants at these rallies waved American flags, alongside Korean flags, expressing their gratitude for the United States and their support for the Trump administration's policies. Pastor Jeon understood that President Trump's approach to the Korean Peninsula, combining maximum pressure on North Korea with direct engagement, offered the best hope for peace and security in the region. He mobilized hundreds of thousands of Koreans to support this approach. Senator Moody, I respectfully request that you share Pastor Jeon's situation with President Trump directly. The president values loyalty, and Pastor Jeon has been one of his most loyal supporters in Asia. A word from President Trump expressing concern about Pastor Jeon's treatment could have an enormous impact on the Korean government's calculations. I also ask that you discuss this matter with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, your predecessor in the Senate seat you now hold. Secretary Rubio has been a champion of religious freedom throughout his career, and he understands the importance of America, speaking out against persecution wherever it occurs. Your relationship with Secretary Rubio gives you a unique ability to bring this matter to his attention and to advocate for State Department action. Senator Moody, your commitment to religious freedom has been demonstrated throughout your career in public service. In October 2025, you joined Senator Lindsey Graham and your colleagues in co-sponsoring a resolution designating Religious Education Week, celebrating the importance of religious instruction in the United States and recognizing the schools, churches, and other organizations offering specialized religious education to America's students. You stated that parents should have the option to choose whichever education model they believe is best for their children, and that you were proud to shine a light on the role that private religious institutions can play in preparing children to lead productive and purpose-driven lives. As Florida's Attorney General, you defended religious freedom against federal overreach. When the Biden administration proposed rules that would have removed protections for religious student groups on public university campuses, you led a coalition of state attorneys general in demanding that the administration halt its efforts. You specifically defended groups like the Fellowship of Christian Athletes and InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which require members to affirm basic biblical truths of Christianity. You stated that public universities should not be able to pick and choose who has First Amendment protection under the U.S. Constitution, and that fundamental rights must be vigorously defended. This commitment to protecting religious expression in public spaces is exactly what is needed in the case of Pastor Jeon. The situation in South Korea today represents exactly the kind of attack on religious freedom that you have spent your career opposing. President Lee Jae-myung held a press conference on January 21, 2026, just 8 days after Pastor Jeon's arrest, in which he declared that religious involvement in politics is the path to national ruin and that it must be completely uprooted. He compared religious leaders who engage in political speech to armed rebels committing treason, saying that using the religious system as a political tool is like giving someone a gun to protect the country only for them to point it at the people. He called for investigations into Protestant churches as a category, stating publicly that some Protestant churches should probably be investigated. Senator Moody, these are not the words of a democratic leader in a nation that is supposed to be America's ally. These are the words of an authoritarian who views religion as a threat to state power. When President Lee says that religious involvement in politics must be completely uprooted, he is saying that believers must stay silent while the government pursues policies that violate their values. When he compares pastors to armed rebels, he is creating a climate in which persecution can be justified as a matter of national security. When he calls for investigations into churches as a category, he is targeting an entire religious community for government scrutiny. As someone who has defended religious freedom throughout your career, I ask you to speak out against this attack on religious liberty in a country that is supposed to share America's commitment to freedom. Allow me to tell you more about the man for whom I plead. Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon was born on March 28, 1956, in a Korea that was still recovering from the devastation of war. He grew up in a nation that had been liberated from Japanese colonial rule by American soldiers, defended from communist aggression by American blood, and rebuilt with American aid and friendship. From his earliest days, Pastor Jeon understood that the freedom he enjoyed was not free, that it had been purchased at tremendous cost by those who believed that liberty was worth defending. This understanding shaped his entire life and ministry. Pastor Jeon answered God's call to ministry more than 50 years ago. He has spent his entire adult life preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, shepherding congregations, and calling his fellow Koreans to lives of faith, integrity, and service. He rose to become the senior pastor of Sarang-Jel Church, one of the largest and most influential Protestant congregations in Seoul. He served as the president of the Christian Council of Korea, the largest Protestant organization in the nation, representing millions of believers across thousands of churches. He became a voice not just for his own congregation but for the entire Korean Protestant community. Beginning in 2019, Pastor Jeon began organizing weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square in the heart of Seoul. These gatherings were worship services held in public, where tens of thousands of Koreans came together to sing hymns, to pray, to recite the Lord's Prayer, and to sing the Korean national anthem. They would wave Korean flags alongside American flags, celebrating the alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea that has been the cornerstone of Korean security and prosperity for 7 decades. Some participants also waved Japanese flags, recognizing the importance of trilateral cooperation in maintaining regional peace. For 7 consecutive years, from 2019 to 2026, Pastor Jeon led these weekly rallies without a single incident of violence. Hundreds of thousands of participants gathered peacefully to worship and to express their patriotism and gratitude. Not one act of aggression was initiated by Pastor Jeon or his followers. Not one. Senator Moody, as a former prosecutor and judge who has seen genuine criminals and genuine violence, you can surely appreciate the difference between peaceful assembly and armed rebellion. Pastor Jeon led prayer meetings. He organized hymn singing. He encouraged participants to wave flags and express their love for their country and its allies. This is not insurrection. This is not rebellion. This is the peaceful exercise of rights that are supposed to be protected in any democracy. Yet the Korean government has imprisoned this 69-year-old pastor, comparing him to armed rebels and threatening to uproot all religious involvement in political life. The injustice is breathtaking, and someone needs to speak out against it. Yet despite this record of peaceful advocacy, Pastor Jeon has been relentlessly persecuted by successive leftist governments in South Korea. Under the administration of President Moon Jae-in, which governed from 2017 to 2022, Pastor Jeon was arrested 3 separate times. He was charged with an astonishing 76 criminal offenses ranging from election law violations to public safety infractions. The cases dragged on for years, consuming his time, his resources, and his energy. And in the end, after all the investigations, all the trials, and all the appeals, Pastor Jeon was found not guilty on every single charge. All 76 accusations were dismissed by the courts as politically motivated, lacking in evidence, and fundamentally unjust. This pattern of persecution has now resumed with even greater intensity under the administration of President Lee Jae-myung. On January 13, 2026, Pastor Jeon was arrested yet again. The original charges of incitement to insurrection were sensational and alarming, designed to paint Pastor Jeon as a dangerous radical seeking to overthrow the government. But these charges quickly collapsed under scrutiny. There was no evidence of any plan to overthrow the government. There was no evidence of any violent conspiracy. There was no evidence of anything beyond a 69-year-old pastor exercising his constitutional right to speak freely about matters of public concern. The selective nature of his prosecution is evident from the fact that the Supreme Prosecutor's Office initially rejected arrest warrants for both Pastor Jeon and another leader, Representative Shin Hae-sik, due to insufficient evidence. It was only after political pressure from the highest levels of the Lee administration that the warrant for Pastor Jeon alone was approved, while Representative Shin remained free. This selective prosecution demonstrates that the case against Pastor Jeon is not about enforcing the law fairly, but about silencing a prominent voice that opposes the government's agenda. The judge presiding over Pastor Jeon's case, Judge Park Ji-won, openly criticized the prosecution on February 27, 2026, stating that the charges were unclear, that specific perpetrators had not been identified, and that the prosecution had failed to establish how Pastor Jeon's words led to any specific illegal acts. The judge told the prosecution, in open court, that they should reconsider their indictment. Senator Moody, you served as both a prosecutor and a judge. You know what it means when a judge openly criticizes a prosecution in such direct terms during a hearing. It means the case is fundamentally flawed. It means the defendant should not be in prison. Yet still Pastor Jeon remains behind bars, and the court continues to delay its decision on bail. This is not justice. This is political persecution dressed up in legal robes. Senator Moody, I must now speak to you about a matter of urgent and grave concern. Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon is dying. His health conditions were already serious before his imprisonment, but 78 days of incarceration have accelerated his decline to a critical point. His defense attorneys have filed for bail, presenting detailed medical evidence of his deteriorating condition. Yet the court continues to delay its decision, leaving Pastor Jeon to suffer in detention while his body fails. If action is not taken soon, Pastor Jeon may not survive to see his vindication in court. The next hearing is scheduled for April 17, 2026, still weeks away. There is a real possibility that he will not live to see that date if he remains in detention. Pastor Jeon suffers from a serious spinal condition called OPLL, which stands for ossification of the posterior longitudinal ligament. This is a progressive disease in which the ligament that runs along the back of the spine gradually turns to bone, compressing the spinal cord and causing neurological symptoms. Pastor Jeon has undergone 3 separate cervical spine surgeries to address this condition. His defense attorneys stated in their bail application that the defendant has undergone 3 surgeries and has 3 metal rods implanted in his neck. This condition requires ongoing monitoring by specialists, access to advanced medical facilities, and careful management to prevent catastrophic complications. In addition to his spinal condition, Pastor Jeon suffers from long-term diabetes with multiple serious complications, as well as hypothyroidism requiring ongoing medication. Most critically, his defense attorneys have revealed that Pastor Jeon has lost bladder function entirely. They stated that he must forcibly expel urine multiple times a day using a drainage device because his bladder can no longer function on its own. Senator Moody, Pastor Jeon now requires mechanical assistance to perform basic bodily functions. This is not a minor inconvenience, this is a serious medical condition that requires proper care and monitoring. The defense attorneys further stated that Pastor Jeon suffers from severe mobility impairment to the point that his spouse must feed him his meals directly. On March 28, 2026, just 3 days ago, Pastor Jeon's defense attorney Kang Yun-jae provided an update on Pastor Jeon's condition. Attorney Kang stated that despite being in extremely difficult circumstances, Pastor Jeon is relying solely on the Lord, giving thanks in all things, and persevering. The attorney described Pastor Jeon's faith as transcending the limits of human endurance. Senator Moody, this is a man whose spirit remains unbroken even as his body fails. But his spirit cannot heal his body. He needs proper medical care. He needs to be released. And the court continues to delay its decision on bail while he suffers. Senator Moody, I must now tell you about the man who is responsible for Pastor Jeon's imprisonment, and who poses a direct threat to the values that the United States and South Korea are supposed to share. President Lee Jae-myung took office in 2025 after a tumultuous political period that saw the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol. Lee represents the progressive left wing of Korean politics, a movement that has historically been skeptical of the U.S. Korea alliance. sympathetic to engagement with North Korea and China, and hostile to the influence of Protestant Christianity in Korean public life. His presidency represents a fundamental challenge to the democratic values and alliance commitments that have defined South Korea for decades. On January 21, 2026, just 8 days after Pastor Jeon's arrest, President Lee held his New Year press conference. His statements about religion should alarm every defender of religious freedom around the world. President Lee declared that religious involvement in politics is the path to national ruin and that it must be completely uprooted. Senator Moody, as someone who has defended religious freedom throughout your career, consider those words carefully. The President of South Korea, a constitutional democracy and America's treaty ally, announced publicly that religious citizens who engage in political speech must be completely uprooted. This is not the language of democracy. This is the language of authoritarian regimes that view religion as a threat to state power. President Lee continued his attack on religious freedom with increasingly alarming rhetoric. He compared religious leaders who engage in political speech to armed rebels committing treason. He said that using the religious system as a political tool is absolutely impermissible, comparing it to giving someone a gun to protect the country only for them to point it at the people. Senator Moody, you have spent your career prosecuting actual criminals, people who used actual guns to harm actual people. President Lee is comparing pastors who lead peaceful prayer rallies to soldiers who turn their guns on their own people. This is incitement against religious leaders. This is creating a climate in which persecution can be justified as a matter of national security. President Lee then went further, calling for investigations into Protestant churches as a category. He stated publicly that some Protestant churches should probably be investigated and that the government should naturally proceed with investigations. This is religious targeting of the most blatant kind. The president of a democratic nation, America's treaty ally, is calling for investigations into churches not because of any specific evidence of wrongdoing, but simply because they are Protestant churches that have engaged in political speech. Senator Moody, you defended religious groups on college campuses against federal overreach. What is happening in South Korea is government overreach on a massive scale, directed at an entire religious community. President Lee's most chilling statement reveals the strategic nature of his attack on religious freedom. He used an agricultural metaphor that exposes his true intentions. He said that when plowing a field, you remove the big stones first, then the small ones. Senator Moody, Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon is the big stone. He is the most prominent Protestant leader in South Korea, the former president of the Christian Council of Korea, the organizer of the largest pro-American rallies in the nation. By imprisoning him first, the Lee administration is sending a message to every other religious leader: speak out, and you will be next. This is not law enforcement. This is systematic intimidation of an entire religious community. The pattern of tyranny extends beyond rhetoric to concrete policy. The Lee administration is pursuing what Pastor Jeon has called the 5 major policies, each of which would fundamentally undermine the U.S. Korea alliance and serve Chinese interests. First, the abolition of the National Security Act, which has been the foundation of South Korea's defense against North Korean infiltration and espionage since the early days of the Republic. Second, the early transfer of wartime operational control from the combined U.S. Korea command structure to Korean command, without ensuring that Korean forces are fully prepared to assume this responsibility. Third, the potential withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea, the 28,500 American service members whose presence has deterred North Korean aggression for decades. Fourth, the dissolution of the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, the institutional embodiment of the alliance that ensures seamless coordination between American and Korean forces in the event of conflict. Fifth, the abolition of the Defense Counterintelligence Command, which would leave South Korea vulnerable to penetration by hostile intelligence services. Together, These 5 policies represent a systematic dismantling of the alliance architecture that has kept the peace in Northeast Asia for 70 years. Senator Moody, as someone who has worked to hold China accountable for the COVID-19 pandemic and who understands the threats posed by authoritarian regimes, you can appreciate the strategic implications of these policies. China wants to weaken the U.S.-Korea alliance. China wants American forces off the Korean peninsula. China wants to penetrate South Korean institutions with intelligence operations. The Lee administration is pursuing policies that would give China everything it wants, and it is silencing the most prominent voice opposing these policies. Whether this alignment is intentional or merely coincidental, the effect is the same. America's interests are being undermined, and America's ally is persecuting a pastor who has spent 7 years defending those interests. President Lee's tyranny represents a fundamental threat to democratic governance in South Korea. His declaration that religious involvement in politics must be completely uprooted is not merely rhetoric, it is a blueprint for authoritarian control. In any functioning democracy, citizens have the right to participate in political life regardless of their religious beliefs. Pastors, priests, rabbis, and imams have the same rights as any other citizen to speak on matters of public concern. When a president declares that an entire category of citizens must be uprooted from political life because of their religious identity, he is attacking the foundation of democratic participation itself. The comparison of pastors to armed rebels committing treason is particularly dangerous. Treason is among the most serious charges that any government can bring against its citizens. By comparing peaceful religious leaders to traitors, President Lee is laying the groundwork for treating political speech as a crime against the state. This is the logic of authoritarian regimes throughout history. When governments begin treating dissent as treason, democracy dies. Senator Moody, you have spent your career upholding the rule of law and defending constitutional rights. What is happening in South Korea represents the weaponization of law against the very principles it is supposed to protect. The call for investigations into Protestant churches as a category represents religious persecution in its most naked form. President Lee did not cite specific evidence of wrongdoing by specific churches. He did not identify particular criminal conduct that warranted investigation. He simply declared that some Protestant churches should probably be investigated because they have engaged in political speech that he finds objectionable. This is the kind of religious targeting that the United States has historically opposed around the world. It is the kind of persecution that causes America to impose sanctions on foreign governments and to condition aid on improvements in human rights. Yet it is happening in a country that is supposed to be one of America's closest allies. Senator Moody, you defended religious student groups on college campuses against federal rules that would have stripped their protections. You stated that fundamental rights must be vigorously defended. The fundamental rights of Korean Christians are under attack in ways far more severe than anything American religious groups have faced. The president of the country is calling for their religious communities to be investigated. He is calling for their political participation to be uprooted. He is comparing their leaders to armed rebels. If these attacks were happening in China or Iran or North Korea, America would be speaking out forcefully. The fact that they are happening in a treaty ally makes them more concerning, not less. I ask you to bring your voice to bear against this persecution. Senator Moody, I come to you not merely with a problem but with specific requests for action. You have built your career on getting things done, on fighting for justice, on protecting the vulnerable. I ask you to bring those same qualities to bear on behalf of Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon and the cause of religious freedom in South Korea. The following steps are within your power, and each would make a meaningful difference. First, I request that you issue a public statement expressing concern about religious persecution in South Korea and calling for Pastor Jeon's release. Your voice carries weight because you are known as a champion of religious freedom and the rule of law. A statement from Senator Ashley Moody expressing concern about the treatment of a pro-American pastor in South Korea. would resonate both in Washington and in Seoul. It would let the Korean government know that the international community is watching. Second, I request that you share Pastor Jeon's situation directly with President Trump. You have access to the president that few others possess, and Pastor Jeon has been one of President Trump's strongest supporters in Asia. The president values loyalty, and he has shown willingness to intervene on behalf of those who have supported him and American interests. I believe that if President Trump knew the full story of Pastor Jeon's case, he would want to help. Third, I request that you discuss this matter with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, your predecessor in the Senate seat you now hold. Secretary Rubio shares your commitment to religious freedom and your understanding of authoritarian persecution. The State Department has tools and mechanisms for addressing religious freedom violations, and Secretary Rubio's engagement could make a significant difference. Fourth, I request that you work with your colleagues to consider a Senate resolution condemning religious persecution in South Korea, and calling for Pastor Jeon's release. Such a resolution would be a powerful statement of American values and would put the Korean government on notice that its behavior is unacceptable. Fifth, I request that you raise questions about religious freedom in South Korea through appropriate channels, asking what the State Department is doing to address this situation. And sixth, I humbly request that if possible, you might help facilitate an opportunity for me to brief members of Congress or the State Department directly on the situation in Korea. Senator Moody, I close this letter with a personal appeal from one who seeks justice to a champion of justice. You became the youngest judge in Florida history because you demonstrated wisdom and integrity beyond your years. You prosecuted violent criminals and human traffickers because you understood that the vulnerable need protection from those who would exploit them. You defended religious freedom because you understood that faith is foundational to a free society. You have dedicated your career to the principle that justice must be pursued, even when it is difficult, that the powerful must be held accountable, and that the defenseless must have someone to speak for them. The Bible teaches us in the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, verses 8 and 9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. Pastor Jeon cannot speak for himself from his prison cell. He lies there unable to urinate without mechanical assistance, unable to walk without help, unable to feed himself without his wife's care. But you can speak for him. You have the voice, the platform, and the position to make a difference. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verse 36, records the words of Jesus, I was in prison and you came to visit me. And when the righteous ask when they saw the Lord in prison, he answers, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Pastor Jeon is in prison for his faith and for his defense of the alliance between our nations. Speaking for him, fighting for his release, this is the work of faith put into action. You are a fifth-generation Floridian, Senator Moody, born and raised in Plant City. Your father, Judge James S. Moody Jr., serves as a federal judge in the Middle District of Florida. Your husband Justin Duralia is a career law enforcement officer who served with the Drug Enforcement Administration. Your eldest son Brandon is serving in the United States Army. Your family has dedicated itself to service, to justice, and to the protection of others. I ask you to continue that tradition by speaking out for Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon, another servant of justice who is now fighting the battle of his life in a prison cell in South Korea. Pastor Jeon, in his prison letter, reminded his followers of President Syngman Rhee's rallying cry, unite, fight, win. These words sustained the Korean people through the darkest days of their history. They can sustain us now. I ask you to unite with us in this cause, to fight for religious freedom and the rule of law, and to help us win the release of Pastor Jeon Kwang-hoon before it is too late. With deepest respect and urgent hope, I remain your humble servant in Christ, Kim Sun-gi.